In our episodes, we discuss cases and topics that might be distressing or disturbing to some listeners. Listener discretion is advised. Hello, everybody. Welcome back to Cardinal Crimes. If you are new, I am Becca, a former intelligence analyst turned newbie investigator, and I research cold cases in my spare time. Now, just a couple months ago, I wrapped up a 6-part series covering the 1980 unsolved murders of Rose Burkert, Roger Atkinson, and William Kyle, and the unsolved 1970 murder of Jack McDonald. While I was doing research on the suspects in those cases, as many believe they are all connected, I began reading up on Roger Atkinson's uncle-in-law, Charles Hatcher. Charles was Roger's wife's dad's brother, and just so happened to be a serial killer. While you might think that makes him an obvious suspect in those murders, he was eventually ruled out. But during my research, I learned that Charles Hatcher went by multiple aliases. Albert Price, Ronald Springer, Doris Mullins were just a few I found in my research. He also went by Richard Clark. And this name stuck with me. Richard Clark. I thought for weeks, why does this sound familiar? It's a generic name, but something was nagging at me. And then one day, and my husband can confirm this, I was sitting on the couch writing out my notes for one of the episodes on the Rose Burkert Roger Atkinson case, and I literally shrieked. I remembered the unsolved murder of Dorothy Miller. Dorothy was a 48-year-old real estate agent in Burlington, Iowa. She was found murdered in a home she had shown a client on August 19, 1969. She was found in a closet on the second floor of the home. Her hands were tied in front of her, and she had been sexually assaulted and stabbed 22 times. The client? He had actually met Dorothy's husband, Fred, who normally accompanied her on house showings. The three of them had viewed the home before, and the client had called back to see if he could see it for a second time so he could take photos for his wife. On this second showing, scheduled for 7:30 p.m. on August 18th, Fred couldn't go with, so Dorothy went alone. But Fred saw the client, and so did multiple patrons of the Maple Leaf Tavern in downtown Burlington, where the client waited for Dorothy to pick him up. The man is believed to be the person who murdered Dorothy, and the name he gave? Robert Clark. I thought that was interesting. Hatcher, who has for sure been to Iowa multiple times in his lifetime, called himself Richard Clark. This guy called himself Robert Clark. It's generic enough, though, but because of the number of people who saw this man, a composite sketch was made. I compared the sketch to a 1965 mugshot of Charles Hatcher, and wow, does it look similar. Hooded eyes, bushy eyebrows, a wide nose, similar ears, and an identical hairline. I had myself convinced that this was the man who killed Dorothy Miller. I was so convinced, in fact, that I submitted a tip to both the Burlington Sheriff's Office and the Iowa Cold Case Unit. Both kindly thanked me for the information and said they'd look into it. I showed my friends and family a side-by-side of his mugshot and the sketch, and they all agreed. This is the guy. I was so sure of myself for a number of days, but then I remembered the multiple comments on a write-up I did of Dorothy's case and published on the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. Many people said the crime seemed very similar to the alleged crimes committed by a man named Mike DeBardelibin. And a side-by-side comparison of Mike and the sketch, the same. I started to doubt my Hatcher theory. Hatcher's crimes seemed different than what happened to Dorothy, and he seemed to target young boys. DeBardelibin, on the other hand, is believed to have killed female real estate agents in an almost identical fashion. But so far in my limited research, I have no record of him ever being in Iowa. I want to do some digging into each of these men and see if there is anything solid, linking them to Dorothy's murder. With both, I'm going to start from the beginning. I want to learn about their early life when they began committing crimes, take a deeper look at each of their victims, and see if their crimes are similar to what happened to Dorothy. I want to try to track down where each of them were in August of 1969, and specifically August 19th, and see if anything stands out. So today, we are going to start with Charles Hatcher. Charles Hatcher was born on July 16th, 1929, to Jess and Lula Hatcher. He was born just months before the onset of the Great Depression, and while this period was marked by poverty, his family was described in a 1983 Quad City Times article written by Chris Jensen, Terry Hughes, Kent Darr, Mike Anton, Gary Sawyer, and Beverly Van Hook as the, quote, poorest of the poor. Charles grew up in a small wood-framed 3-bedroom home in northwest Missouri, and that was considered particularly bare-bones and sparse for the time and area. Charles was one of 4 boys in the Hatcher family, and their father, Jess, did really all he could to scrape by. The Hatcher family survived off of whatever animals his dad could hunt, and he made money from selling the pelts. His father also took sparse farm work wherever he could find it, making just 50 cents or $1 a day. Those who knew the Hatcher family described them as usually keeping to themselves, and they described Charles particularly as being a quiet boy. Now, there isn't a lot of information about Charles' early years, except that he maybe only had an education up until maybe the 7th or 8th grade. But this Quad City Times article says none of the schools in the area where the Hatcher boys grew up have records of any of them, though they claim it wasn't uncommon for schools back in the day to lose records when, districts would be consolidated or something like that. However, there was one moment in Charles' youth that was documented and could have been a defining moment, or at least had an impact on him. On April 26, 1936, when Charles was just 7 years old, the Hatcher boys were playing outside when Charles' 8-year-old brother Arthur unwrapped a copper wire from an old Model T. Reports say he twisted the end around a rock and threw it over an electrical line that ran alongside the house. Arthur was electrocuted and died. One brother burnt his hand attempting to grab the wire to help Arthur, while another brother ran inside to help. Charles saw it all. As a young man, Charles Hatcher was described as not being able to stay out of trouble. And right at the age of 18, and for the rest of his life, he was in and out of prison and mental institutions for various offenses. He escaped from these various prisons and hospitals multiple times or was just let go. Everything I have gathered from Charles Hatcher's story paints him as an extremely manipulative person, but also someone who suffered from genuine mental disorders, but would also exploit that to new doctors to get a reduced time. Charles' first arrest was at the age of 18, when on October 9th, 1947, he stole a 1.5-ton truck. He had just gotten a job as a truck driver for a log company, but was only working there for a matter of weeks, and it looks like the truck he stole was from the company he worked at. He claimed he was intoxicated at the time. In 1948, he got a job washing dishes at a St. Joseph, Missouri hotel, but was sent to prison shortly after when he was convicted of, once again, stealing a vehicle. For this, he was sentenced to 2 years in the Missouri State Penitentiary, but was released on June 8th, 1949, after serving less than 3/4 of his sentence. Now, apparently on October 10th, 1949, so just months after being released, he was convicted of forging a $10 check at a gas station and was sentenced to 3 more years in the Missouri State Penitentiary, which to me seems kind of crazy. But he was in prison for only about 1.5 years when he escaped for the first of many times. He apparently just walked away from a, quote, prison farm detail. He was, though, eventually caught, and they tacked on 2 more years to his sentence. He was then released on July 14th, 1954, and less than a year later, he was back in prison for car theft attempt number 3, to which he was sentenced to 4 years. 2 years were added onto that after he tried to escape once again. On March 18th, 1959, Charles Hatcher was once again released. Now, up until this point, Charles' crimes had been nonviolent for the most part, forging checks, stealing cars, but in 1959, his crimes significantly escalate. Hatcher was charged in connection with stealing yet another vehicle, almost running over a police officer, and threatening a 16-year-old newspaper boy with a butcher knife, and trying to literally force this kid into his car. When Hatcher was arraigned, he reportedly refused to speak, and articles describe him as being, quote, mute. And the articles, the way they describe it, it's more than just him refusing to talk, but him acting as if he didn't talk or couldn't talk. And like I said, there are legitimate documents of him having severe mental illness, but he is also believed to have really feigned incompetency multiple times in an attempt to get out of jail. Hatcher received a 5-year prison sentence for this and once again attempted to escape while being transported to the Missouri State Penitentiary, but he was unsuccessful. Now, while Hatcher was in prison, on July 2nd, 1961, an inmate at the prison with him, Jerry Tharrington, was found raped and stabbed to death on the prison's kitchen loading dock. Hatcher was apparently the only one missing from the kitchen crew at the time of the murder. He was reportedly sent to solitary confinement for Tharrington's murder, but that was really the only punishment they gave him because there wasn't enough evidence to convict him. While in solitary confinement, Hatcher wrote a note to workers at the prison saying he had come to the realization that he needed psychological treatment. But the prison psychologist believed that this was just a scheme and refused to provide him treatment. Hatcher was released in 1963. Now, according to the Quad City Times article, it doesn't say the exact year, but I believe in 1964, Hatcher was in prison yet again, but this time in Kansas on a burglary charge, when he and another inmate escaped by bashing a jailer over the head with an iron handle and then stealing his station wagon. But he was arrested in Oklahoma 5 days later and held in jail, but he must have been either let out or maybe he escaped once again, because it says that he apparently paid no price for this escape and that the charges were dropped in 1967 because he was back in prison in Missouri. So the timeline here is a little confusing. But around this time, we learn a little more about his mental health. As Hatcher himself repeatedly asked for mental examinations, and whether or not this was a farce, it's hard to tell, but it was discovered that he may have had some significant head injuries in his life. One of Hatcher's defense attorneys in the mid-60s said there were pellets in the back of Charles' head from being shot several months earlier, and that this was affecting his thinking. And in another motion requesting an examination, it was said that Hatcher had suffered a severe head injury from 15 years prior, and he had never completely recovered from it, and that he now suffered from severe pain, frequent headaches, lapses in memory, and depression. Now, this was all put forward from his defense attorneys in a motion to say he wasn't competent to stand trial, and this was ultimately rejected. Now, this article says he was released in 1967, but was quickly caught back in Kansas for another stolen car and was sentenced to 5 years in prison there. 5 years he would not serve. Now, here is where we are getting to the timeline we are wanting to see if he could have possibly been involved with Dorothy's death. Remember, Dorothy Miller was murdered on August 18th, 1969, and was found on the 19th. One source I am using for this is this really nice in-depth timeline of his arrests and major life moments, but there's a gap in that timeline from 1963 to August 27th, 1969. Now, I have filled in that gap with the Quad City Times article I've referenced multiple times, and I think we might have our answer here in that section, so let's read this together. Whether or not we find a solid yes or no, we'll continue to look at Charles' story, but let's take a look here. This section of the article reads, quote, "The California Years, Sanity and Insanity." It was a busy 8 days for Hatcher in August 1969. In a week and a day, he would escape from prison in Kansas, travel cross-country to California, assault a child in San Francisco, and begin a 3.5-year odyssey through California's mental competency laws. It was during that odyssey that Hatcher's story begins to turn into something very strange. During that time, he would be found insane and later sane on 4 different occasions. Once, he was found insane and committed to the same mental institution that he had been found sane at, under a different name 4 months earlier. It says it all started on August 29th, 1969, when police in the Ingleside district of San Francisco received a call that a young child was being beaten and sexually molested in a field. Hatcher was arrested under the name Albert Ralph Price. Okay. So on August 29th, 1969, Charles Hatcher is in California. The article says it took 8 days for him to escape from the Kansas prison and get there. So he would have had to have escaped on August 21st. So that wouldn't work with the timeline for Dorothy's murder. My case is crumbling here, but let's see if we can find another source for this. I purchased a book titled Innocent Blood, A True Story of Obsession and Serial Murder by Terry Gainey. This book has also been previously titled St. Joseph's Children, and it's all about Charles Hatcher and his crimes. Let's do a quick search in this book for the year 1969. I haven't read the whole book yet, but let's just do a quick search. And yeah, guys, this is a case closed. Charles Hatcher is not our guy for the murder of Dorothy Miller. The book, which I haven't read in full, right? It has a detailed timeline at the very end. So this is what it says here. December 7th, 1967. Sentenced to the Kansas State Penitentiary for 1 to 5 years for car theft in Kansas City. Escaped from a prison farm on August 21st, 1969. This would make it impossible for him to be in Burlington, Iowa in the days before and on Dorothy Miller's murder. So, I'm not going to lie, I do feel a little bit of disappointment here. But really, my theory was not based on strong evidence, right? Like, my connection was based on Charles Hatcher having been in Iowa multiple times throughout his life, the use of his aliases like Richard Clark, which is close to the name Robert Clark, and his mugshot being very similar to the sketch released of said Robert Clark. So, it was, I'll admit, a flimsy case. But yes, I was thoroughly convinced I was right for just a minute. But alas, I was wrong. But don't fret, we have another prime suspect that we will be looking into. Mike DeBardelibin, and he might fit the profile of who killed Dorothy even better, if we can manage to track down his whereabouts in 1969. However, we're not done with Charles Hatcher. I think in a general sense, there's still a lot we can learn about him, and he does have a really interesting story from a true crime perspective, but I want to highlight the known victims of his crimes so they are not lost in all of this. So we are going to continue next week and talk about his crimes from 1969 until his eventual arrest and death in the mid-80s. So stay tuned for that. We will see you next week. Thank you for listening to this episode of Cardinal Crimes. If you enjoyed it, please consider subscribing, giving us a 5-star review wherever you get your podcast, and sharing this episode with others. You can find us on TikTok, YouTube, and Instagram with the handle @CardinalCrimes, and you can send us any case suggestions, questions, or topics you would like covered there or to our email, cardinalcrimes@gmail.com. Until next time, friends, take care of each other and take care of yourself. If you've ever thought about starting your own podcast, there's no better place to begin than with Buzzsprout. It's the platform I use, and it makes publishing, promoting, and tracking your episodes so easy, even if you're not tech savvy. Plus, they help you get listed in all the major directories like Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and more. And here's the best part. When you sign up for a paid Buzzsprout plan using my affiliate link, you'll get $20 off, and you'll be supporting the show at the same time. Just head to the description of this episode to find the affiliate link. Now, let's get back to the episode.